I'm actually here this morning to introduce Mike Cohen, and when I talked to Mike this morning, he asked me to make sure that I cover all of his many accomplishments, so that is what I'm going to do. Mike graduated from high school on the dean's list. He ran the 440, much faster then than he does now. Actually, you will find his bio in your materials, and I'm not going to go over all of that. But I do want to just say a word about the leadership that Mike has provided around the Common Core, along with CCSSO and others. His team, led by Mike, has been absolutely terrific, frankly, in getting this right for all of us, and continues to work on behalf of all of the states that are part of the Common Core. You may also know that Ohio is part of the Park Assessment Consortium, also being led by Achieve. So I want to thank Mike for being here today. He knows Ohio very well. He has been with us for the number of years, knows our accomplishments, knows our challenges, and we are very lucky to have him with us this morning. So please join me in welcoming my friend and boss, Mike Cohen.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for going back over all of the highlights of my academic career. I wasn't all that fast in the 440 when I ran it in high school, but Lisa's right, I am a lot slower now than I was back then. I am really, really pleased to be here with you today, and particularly pleased that Achieve was able to be one of the co-sponsors of this conference. As Lisa pointed out, Achieve has a very long relationship with Ohio. In fact, when he was governor, Governor Voinovich was one of the founding board members for Ohio, and we have always had either a governor or a business leader from Ohio on the Achieve board. Jeff Wadsworth at Patel is currently on the Achieve board. So we have a long history of working with policy leaders and the business community here in Ohio, and I'm particularly pleased to be able to continue that long history. My job this morning is primarily to give you a little bit of a deeper understanding and insight into what the Common Core standards are about and where you can expect the park assessments to end up. I had dinner with a small group last night, and the first question I got is, where are the sample items? So I have in my pocket here, no. The sample items are under development. I want you to think about this for a second. If we had done what is so often done when you adopt some new standards and you begin to develop new tests, what is often done is the first thing you do is go back to the bank of items that you already have and start recycling those, both for the tests themselves and also to provide some idea of what the tests are going to look like. The 24 states in PARC chose not to do that because they understood that these standards are fundamentally different than the standards that most states have. And if the assessments are correspondingly different, then we will send absolutely the wrong signals, reinforce absolutely the wrong kind of instructional strategies, all in the sake of saying, here's something for you to look at. So I will show you some other things that will give you some idea of where the assessments are going. We hope we are developing, particularly for the more innovative performance-based component of the park assessments, we are developing some prototypes now. We are field testing them. We're piloting them, and when we're sure that they're right, we will make them available so people can see what we are looking for. So stay tuned on that. Before I jump into this, I just want to pick up on some of the comments that Stan mentioned. So when Stan talked about the enormously high remediation rate of public high school graduates in post-secondary institutions in Ohio, you should know on that issue and on so many others, you are not alone. That is a national phenomenon. In 2004, Achieve launched the American Diploma Project. Ohio was one of the founding states in that. And that came together because we were amassing more and more evidence that students were earning high school diplomas and not being well prepared for what came next. So when you surveyed employers and said, are the kids you hire out of high school, are they prepared to do the job that you've hired them for? about 50% of the employers said, well, yes, just for the job I hired them for. But as for having a future in this company, not with the skill set that they have. When we asked college faculty members in a survey, are the students who were in your credit-bearing courses, not the 40% who were in remedial courses, but those in credit-bearing courses, are they well prepared to do the work that you've got in your course? About 40%, they estimated that about 40% of the students that they were teaching in credit-bearing courses could barely make it in those courses. When we surveyed high school graduates themselves, 18 to 21-year-old students, and said, well, now that you're out in the real world, or at least what passes for the real world if you're 18 to 21 years old, if you're in the college classroom or if you are working, how well prepared do you think you are academically, right, to do the work you have to do? Between 40 and 45% of the recent high school graduates said, well, now that you ask, actually not all that well prepared. I've got some pretty significant gaps in my skills now that I see what's expected of me. The most compelling data from that survey, by the way, was when we asked the question in a variety of different ways, if you knew then, when you were in high school, what you know now, would you have worked harder? 80% said yes. Would you have taken more rigorous courses? 80% said yes. It became very clear that not only were we not preparing young people for what they need, for the skills they needed immediately after leaving high school, we weren't even telling them what they needed to do to be prepared. That's when it became clear that in an era when almost all jobs are going to require some kind of post-secondary education or training, 2-year institution, 4-year institution, apprenticeship program, on-the-job training, when almost every career opportunity that we want students to have will require something beyond high school, how shocking it was that we were not, by and large, telling students what they needed to do to prepare themselves for that. That's where this idea of college and career readiness came from, is how do we orient the system? How do we create the right expectations so that students were prepared for success when they met them, instead of the system we have now that Stan described so well. So one of the outgrowths of work across a large number of states that were pursuing that common policy agenda about raising expectations, out of that work came the effort to create the Common Core standards. They were quite deliberately intended to reflect the best evidence that we have about the knowledge and skills that students need to succeed in first-year credit-bearing courses. As Stan pointed out, we drew heavily on what other countries, high-performing countries, expect of their students. We had incredible involvement from higher ed in this, and the standards were created over a couple-year period. I'm going to shift to my slides. This is going to take a moment while I figure out which buttons to push here. Yes, I can speak closer to the microphone. Do I have to repeat that whole warm-up? Okay. Okay, the important part, though, is I ran the 440 in high school, as long as you got that. And meantime, I just have to confess I'm totally lost here. I don't know what button to push to get my slides to come up. And good, I'll keep tap dancing here while... should have told you at the beginning I didn't know how to work the slides. Well, let me keep going, and the slides will catch up. No, Stan, those are yours. I'm not going to give... So yeah, that's right. That's right. You know how Stan said in the old days, right, you would teach 4th grade math, and then the next year you'd repeat it all over again? Well, if these were the old days, I'd be giving Stan's talk right now, but instead, for a moment, we had my slides up there. There we go. Okay. Excellent. So I want to just sort of jump right in. I'm going to spend a little time giving you a little bit more detail, a little bit more flavor, if you will, of the standards. The main message I want you to keep tracking here, though, right, as I move from the standards to the assessment, is these assessments are being designed to basically faithfully, very carefully reflect the standards and reflect the instructional implication of the standards. So at the end of the day, what we're trying to create, right, is an assessment that is driven by instruction, not instruction that is driven by assessment. So that is a very important part of the sort of design and development strategy here. And for those of you who are tired of teaching the bubble test, there'll be some bubbles on this, right? But those will be designed to reflect the instructional priorities and find the most efficient way of measuring them. But as you'll see, this is not all a bubble test. So what are the sort of key advances in the standards in this context? Well, in mathematics, and I assume you all know this. Actually, raise your hand if you've been through some kind of session that oriented you to the Common Core standards. Good. Well, I can breeze through these slides pretty quickly then, because we are not repeating the same stuff. So things I want to highlight here, right, is the focus of the standards in mathematics, right? If those of you who know Bill Schmidt's research know that he found in the 90s that the U.S. math curriculum was a mile wide and an inch deep. We had about 10 times as many topics per grade level. We touched on them as shallowly as one possibly could so that we could repeat them again the next year. Gone. We're not doing that anymore. There is a balance between procedural fluency and conceptual understanding. Both are important. So you have to know the rules, but you have to understand the rules, and you've got to be able to apply them quickly. And there is a real emphasis on mathematical practices, on how mathematicians use quantitative reasoning to think, to reason, to problem solve, and the like. I can't read those slides from here. Okay. The benefit of this focus is that it allows for greater depth at each grade level. So what this slide shows you, right, is the relatively few number of primary topics to be taught and mastered at each grade level. Much more focused, much fewer topics than you find, say, in your math textbooks right now. And that's the point, so that by the time students get to 8th grade, they know these concepts well, they can apply them, they understand them, and they have a good foundation for algebra and advanced mathematics. And I need to continue to hold them. I'm sorry you've missed most of my talk. Okay. You'll get the slides, though. So the third thing I want to show about the math standards, again, don't want to go through these in detail, but the standards not only focus on the math content, but what we call math practices, the ways of thinking and behaving, right, in order to reason quantitatively. And these are not just a list of stuff that would be nice to do. As you will see, these are going to be, first of all, they ought to be reflected in the model curriculum, and they will be reflected in how the assessments are designed. So again, a nice carry through from the priorities and advances in the standards to the curriculum and model instructional units to the assessments. Let me walk through the same analysis quickly in English language arts and literacy, and Stan touched on some of this, right? Key advances in English language arts and literacy, a balance of literature and informational text, and a real balance on text complexity. Right. If you look at the data from the ACT, right, for 11th graders who were taking the ACT, about half of them can't read and comprehend texts that are as complex as they will be reading when they get to college. Not a good sign. If they can't do that by the end of high school, they're really going to have a hard time when they get into any post-secondary training, including in particular technical training programs. So the English language arts literacy standards have a staircase, if you will, of increasing text complexity grade by grade, so that students have to struggle to read some things, but struggle and master it and then go on and be able to read more complex texts. There's an emphasis on information and explanatory writing and on research that has not typically been present in standards, and the literacy standards are not just English language arts, right? They cut across the curriculum, and that places some special responsibilities for teachers and other subjects who will require some special support. Let me give you one example of what this looks like. So this is all about the idea of text-dependent questions, right? At the heart of the standards is the idea that students read complex texts, draw evidence from it, and can use that to make a complex argument, to make an evidence-based, clear, coherent argument. So think about the kind of questions that we often ask students when they confront the text and what kind of shifts we need to make. This is from a sample lesson on Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, a 3-day instructional unit that our friends at Student Achievement Partners who help write the standards have developed. So look at the non-text dependent questions on the left. These are the questions that we often ask students when they read a work like Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, right? This was at a funeral service. Have you ever been to one? Right. This was took place in the Civil War. Why did we have a Civil War? All important questions. You don't have to read a word of the text in order to answer those, right? What students don't do well is actually understand, comprehend, and find evidence in a text and be able to use that information in some way. So now look at the questions on the right-hand side of this. These are questions that require a deep and careful reading of the text, right? 7 years ago, etc. What did Lincoln mean by that, right? Why was he referring back to the point 87 years ago? What happened, and what's important about that? And what can you infer from the text about what happened? At the end, Lincoln talks about unfinished work. He is actually giving an assignment to the rest of the country, and frankly the rest of us, to continue the work of healing the nation. Can students understand that from the text? Can they read the text and draw those kinds of inferences from it? I will tell you, by the way, I actually sat through this lesson. Not easy, right? It was pretty challenging to really get these answers. You had to work at it. But it's the kind of work that students need to do in order to be able to really be able to interpret what they're reading and understand it. So this is a big shift in the kind of instruction that needs to go on. When we get to the end of this, I will point out that this is work, right, shifting the kinds of questions that teachers ask of students when they read material, shifting the kind of questions that you use in the classroom now to shift to text-dependent questions is a very good way to start implementing the standards, and having teachers work together to figure out what good questions would be is a very good form of professional development that could begin immediately. So I wanted to give you that sense, that flavor of the Common Core standards as a background to now shifting into the assessment consortia that Ohio is in, PARC, the Partnership for the Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers. We call it PARC because the rest of it is really a mouthful to say. PARC is a whole lot easier. It begins to roll off the tongue. And you can see the other states that are involved in this. There are now 17, including Ohio, in the darkened in, that are governing states. They are literally at the table making all the decisions about the design of the assessments and their implementation. Achieve's role is basically to manage this process and manage 17 states to get to an agreement, which, by the way, is not a simple task. Stan, it's something you and I should talk about later. I need your vote on some things. So let me go on to the next one. Let me zero in for a second on the design of the assessments. What will this PARC assessment system look like every year? So let me start in the, literally just to the right of center, the performance-based assessment. This is the first of two components of the summative test, the test that would be used for accountability purposes every year. Okay, there is about 3/4 of the way through the year a performance-based assessment. You'll see a little bit of a deeper image of that in a moment, and then a fixed test at the end of the year. Kids sit down a couple of hours and take the test. Here's what's behind this. Remember, we want instruction to drive assessment. Right? We want students in their classroom work, we want them to be reading complex texts, drawing evidence from it, and writing about it. Right? We want them doing research. In mathematics, we want them to take concepts, right, and apply them to real-world problems. We want the tests to reinforce that kind of instruction, and you can't do that on a test that you give at the end of the year, particularly if you want the results back quickly. So we've sectioned off, right, there'll be a couple of sessions, again, about 3/4 of the way through the year, that will have a set of rich performance tasks. The scores on that will count. They'll be added together with the scores from the end of the year test, and that's how you'll determine how many students are basic or proficient or advanced or whatever the performance levels turn out to be. The end of year test we intend to be given actually rather close to the end of the year. Not in April, but more likely late May. That would be ideal. It'd be computer-based. The results should come back quite quickly, we'd like the results to be available to put on a student's report card. We're not saying you have to put it there, but if you just think about timing, you want the results back so that you have them available when you give out the final report card for students. Right. In order to do that, a couple of things are necessary. First of all, the tests have to be given on computer, right, so you can get the quick scoring. That has implications, which we may get into in the question period, about capacity to do that, but that is a big issue here, and it's a challenge in every state. But you can't get faster results if you don't do that. And by the way, if you do have the technology for administering tests, you also have technology to be used for instruction. You don't want to go out and buy stuff just for a test at the end of the year. You want kids, Sam pointed out, but we have a different technology now. We want to be capitalizing on that throughout the year. So the summative test, right, combines these performance-based tasks and end-of-year test. Earlier in the year, we have two other tools that will be available on a flexible basis and on an optional basis. These are not required, but they're strongly encouraging the tools that will be developed. First, diagnostic assessments, right? Probably computer adaptive that you can use in the classroom. Teachers can use as they need to determine where students are now and what kind of misunderstandings they might be having. It's a good way to locate them for instructional purposes in the beginning of the year, but you could administer it throughout the year as teachers need to continue to track student progress and know what kind of instructional support they need. There will be a mid-year assessment, also optional, right? That will be a really robust performance task. It might be a multi-day research project, for example. In fact, you've got some of those under development here, which we are planning on stealing liberally from Ohio. But you've got work like that underway here. These are robust performance tasks. In math, they would clearly involve applying mathematics to novel problems. They involve multi-step research projects in most cases. And those are designed to do two things. One is they're good instructional tasks for students. They engage students in the kind of work that the standards call for. Secondly, they will give students some idea of what the summative performance tasks will look like. So when they confront those later in the year, it's not the first time that they are confronting them. So those are the key components of the PARCC assessments. There'll also be a listening and speaking assessment that is, frankly, still to be designed. So let me drive this forward a little bit further and give you more of a picture of it. Okay, the claims that we will be making, think about this as what we will report out, right, each year on the results of the, first of all, the ELA literacy test. The major statement that we'll make, instead of saying whether a student is proficient or not, will basically be saying whether or not a student is on track to be ready for post-secondary success when they complete high school. And the test will be carefully designed so you can tell that each year. If they score here in 6th grade, are they on track to get to where they need to be at 11th grade? There'll be subclaims, right, subscores, if you will, that will be reported. First, on their ability to read and comprehend a range of complex texts. Secondly, on their ability to write effectively when they use and analyze sources, right? And third, on their ability to present knowledge through research. And then beneath that, you see the further detail that will be reported out. This gives you an idea, right, of what's going to be on the test, right, in order to be able to report these kinds of things. Notice, by the way, that reading and writing are not separated out as two distinct activities. It is your ability to write based on what you read that turns out to be particularly important. If I had more time, I'd go through the next slide in detail, but this basically gives you a more detailed picture, right, of what these performance-based assessments, the ones that will be given about 3/4 of the way through the year, what the components of that will look like. This would take more time than the 3 minutes I have left to go through, but you will have these slides available to you. And actually, I'll show you a quick image of what the end of the year assessment will look like. Remember, there are two components to the summative, but I won't spend more time on that. We can talk about that later. Let me do one thing. Let me contrast the writing assessment from what we see now, right? Remember, what we're going to be asking students to do is read a text, draw evidence from it, and write in response to that. That's not what we do on writing tests now, right? What's most critical is you skim these is that they are decontextualized, non-text dependent props. Right? They ask students to write about something, but they haven't had to draw any evidence from anything. Right? That's not the kind of writing you do anyplace else other than on a end-of-year test. You certainly don't do that in college, and you certainly don't do that in the workplace. So moving right along. I'm going too far. Okay, this is similar. You know what? This is math. Yeah, okay, I'm trying to match up what's on there to what's in front of me. So this is similar to math. What you'll see again is a college-ready claim. Kids will be told each year, are you on track to being ready for college and career? And you see the subcategories, right, of reporting that will be made. Notice, for example, that there's one that has to do with mathematical reasoning. That's on the test, if you will. That will be built into the kinds of items that students will take. Similarly, there's one on modeling, right? So again, it's picking up on those mathematical practices we looked at before. I'm going to breeze through the rest of these real quickly. This will give you an idea of what's going to be on the performance-based tests. I'll have to demonstrate competence in the major content for that grade, as well as mathematical reasoning and modeling using that content. Let me keep going. In the end-of-year test, right, it'll cover a slightly different set of content and skills. Again, computer-based, and will combined with the performance-based assessment, will give you a complete picture of whether the student mastered the content and skills for that grade. One more thing that will show you, again, a contrast here. You don't need to read this in detail. The most critical thing about this is this compares a test in third grade test, or fourth grade math test in Massachusetts with one in Hong Kong. The most important part of the slide is on the right-hand side, where you see all of the things that are on the Massachusetts test that are not measured on the Hong Kong test. We will be able to show you a similar slide in Ohio and the Park assessment down the road. Things that we test now every year, because the standards are more focused, won't be on the test. So teachers won't have to rush through every topic, right, worrying about whether there's going to be something on the test on each item that they miss. This is, again, designed to bring about the sharper focus. In the 1 minute I have left, there are a variety of other tools. Park is not just about creating tests. It's creating about a variety of tools and resources that can support teachers in the classroom. In closing, I want to leave you with two thoughts. One is, and this is reinforcing what Stan said, you should expect that the first year the Park assessments are given, it will look as though the scores have plummeted. It will look as though the scores have plummeted. You need to start now making sure people in your communities understand that your students have not gotten any dumber, right? That you're giving them honest, accurate information about where they stand in today's competitive environment. Secondly, don't wait until 2014, 2015 to start implementing the Common Core. You can start with the early grades. The material I showed you before about text-dependent questions are things in every grade you can get started on right away. Similarly in mathematics. Don't wait, right? It's going to take a while to do this. The transition is going to be difficult. It will be harder if you wait, and I think you've got a lot of material with which to get started. So on that, I'm out of time, and I want to thank you very much.